Darius reckoned that he could deliver a knockout punch with his cavalry located on his right wing, down by the beach, that they could sweep through the enemy cavalry opposed to them and then roll up the battle line of the Macedonians from there. I think that Darius thought about deploying his army and deployed it quite sensibly. The fact that he didn't win the battle was because he was fighting against a man whose military genius was unsurpassed.
Alexander now deployed his army. Despite being outnumbered, the narrowness of the plain, only 2 miles from mountains to sea, allowed him to form an unbroken line of troops along the entire length of the river. Alexander had seen where Darius intended to attack and encircle him, and so he sent as much cavalry as possible to strengthen that wing and hold off the Persians. But to win the battle, he'd have to launch a successful attack of his own. He saw that the Persian wing by the mountains was weak. If his cavalry could break the enemy lines at this point, it could make a direct assault on Darius himself. The king was the heart of the army, and if Alexander could kill or capture him, the massive force he faced would almost certainly collapse.
In an ancient battle, the position of honor was always on the right-hand side. The cream of your army took up position on the right-hand side. In a phalanx, the commander of the phalanx takes up his position on the right-hand side. This is the position of honor, and he worked downwards in rating towards the left. Now, during the period leading up to Alexander's conquest of Persia, there had been attempts to mass your cream on one side, to break the enemy's wing on that side, and this is in fact what Alexander is doing. He is charging with his cavalry against one side, shattering the cohesion of the army on that side, and therefore, to a certain extent, make it much easier for his infantry to come into action.
He takes a very considerable risk in this personal leadership. If Alexander had been killed, I mean, so important was his position in his army, he was irreplaceable. But he realizes that to win all, he must sometimes risk all. That includes his person. But since he only does it with very careful preparation, it shows the greatness of his command.
Well, I think we got distinguished between being authoritarian and autocratic. People confuse these two things. They're almost the absolute opposite. Authoritarian personalities tend to be rigid, close-minded, obsessive, mean, desperately inhibited, particularly inhibiting their aggressive and sexual drives and so forth. Unimaginative, conservative with a small c, conventional, conforming. And Alexander, like most great military commanders, didn't suffer from those defects of character.
His age gave added lustre to his achievements, for though hardly old enough for such undertakings, he was well up to them. There are things generally regarded as rather unimportant, but which are appreciated by soldiers. The fact that he exercised with his men, that he made his appearance little different from an ordinary citizen's, that he had the energy of a soldier. These characteristics, whether they were natural or consciously cultivated, had made him, in the eyes of his men, as much an object of affection as of awe.
The two armies stared at one another. The fields were crammed with men who had walked for weeks through strange lands to face an unknown enemy. Now they prepared to fight each other. Many battles, then and now, are won or lost before they begin. Troops have to be willing to fight, and if necessary, die. Many were scared, soiled with fear. It was the commander and his officers who had to encourage them. Before the first arrow left its bow, the first stone its sling, the discipline and determination of the troops could decide the outcome of this battle.
Alexander sent for his officers and appealed to them for confidence and courage in the coming fight. "Remember," he said, "to preserve discipline in the hour of danger, to advance in utter silence, and when the moment comes, to roar out and put the fear of God into the enemy's hearts. Remember, upon the conduct of each depends the fate of all." Our enemies are men who for centuries have lived soft and luxurious lives. We of Macedonia have trained in the hard school of danger and war. And what of the two men in supreme command? They have Darius. You have Alexander.
I think that the thing that we, as soldiers, most admire about Alexander is his courage. And I don't just mean by that his physical courage, but his physical and his moral courage. He was a very brave man. He was wounded by almost every weapon of war that was available at that time. He quite literally led from the front. He was the first over the wall in his assaults on cities. He endured by a deliberate act of will all the hardships which his soldiers endured. He would pour away his water if he knew his soldiers had no water themselves. So he was physically a very tough, very driven and a very courageous man.
Success had bred in him both a fearlessness and the belief that he was divinely blessed. He sought glory in battle, for he was convinced that in glory lay immortality.
Alexander is the end of a line. He's the end of a line. He is the last of the great generals who actually leads a charge. It is something that historians, even a few ancient historians, have criticized, this leading the charge. Notice the other ones who are mentioned with Alexander, people like Pyrrhus, Hannibal, Caesar, they never lead a charge. They always command from behind the line so that they can see what's going on and make necessary changes to compensate for where they're being defeated and where they're winning and so on. This, of course, Alexander couldn't do. There is always that element in any great general, the idea that he can't fail. The gods are with him and therefore he can do anything he likes and it will work. This sort of supreme self-confidence. I will charge, and because I'm Alexander the Great, I will win.
Greek philosophers debated whether Alexander was truly great or whether it was all down to luck, and they argued the toss on either side. But if it was all down to luck, then one might have expected to see one or two other people managing to do what Alexander did. But if you look at other great commanders in antiquity, someone like Hannibal comes nearest to him, and he ultimately loses. Whereas Alexander never lost. Alexander set himself incredible goals, challenges, competitions to be heroic, and he surmounted these, he achieved them.
Alexander faced the biggest challenge of his life. From his position on the right wing at the head of his elite cavalry, he looked down the ranks of his army. Despite the numerical odds he faced, he felt confident of victory.